In 1971, Mexico City hosted an international women's soccer tournament that was erased from history. Now the story is finally told in Copa 71. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Copa 71 delivers everything you want in a summer movie: surprises, thrills, and big emotions. There's an underlying shock to discover a crucial chapter of sports history that went ignored for 50 years. Filmmakers Rachel Ramsay and James Erskine were uncovering the history from scratch. When they began, the Copa 71 tournament didn't even have a Wikipedia entry. They sought out the players from 6 countries: England, France, Denmark, Italy, Mexico, and Argentina. Most of the women had scarcely spoken about it, but their memories were crystal clear. English player Trudy McCaffrey remembers being amazed in 1971 to see the matches televised.
Never seen women playing on TV at all. First time you saw it, it was just like, wow, you couldn't believe what you were seeing.
The tournament arose because Mexico hosted the Men's World Cup in 1970. It was a financial boon, so local businessmen proposed creating a women's tournament. But it wasn't sanctioned by football's official body, FIFA. Instead, FIFA was opposed and generally pushed back on women's playing. They waited 20 more years before launching the official Women's World Cup in 1991. Brandi Chastain played in that tournament for the United States.
When I was growing up, I didn't ever dream of playing in a World Cup. I never thought about playing in the Olympic Games because they didn't exist. I knew nothing of Copa 1971. No one had ever spoken a word about this tremendous tournament. Ashamed to say that, but it's true.
The filmmakers won the support of executive producers Serena and Venus Williams and Alex Morgan. They completed the film last year with premieres at the Toronto and London film festivals. Now it's being released theatrically in the United States by Greenwich Films. Last week I spoke to Rachel and James. I asked how they learned about this story.
I mean, the idea first actually came from Victoria, our producer, who we've worked with a long time, and she had, her husband had directed to a radio show that she had heard when one of the English women, Chris Lockwood, went on a radio show to sort of make a call out to try and meet the teammates that she hadn't seen for 47 years. And it seemed an extraordinary story, and she had lost contact with all but 2 of the players and that she'd played with, and so we listened to that. We couldn't really believe it had happened, and that it was such a big event that it was supposedly being spoken of. The Azteca Stadium is huge, it is like one of the world's great stadiums, and the idea that there had been a women's soccer match, and not only that, a World Cup final that Rachel and I didn't know about was a bit disappointing, because we'd done a fair number of films in this space before.
Once you knew that this was a historical fact, what were your steps to look into it?
Well, we approached it by first looking for the players, for the women who'd participated in the tournament. We started with the England team. That was who we had the easiest access to. A BBC journalist had helped them to reunite and had done quite a bit of research into them, and I think he set the tone for how everybody else that we met who knew any sort of fraction of the story was incredibly generous with sharing all the research they had done. People realised that this was big, but putting it together was incredibly hard, and trying to find that international angle. So talking to the England team, and then finding the Argentinians, the French, the Italians, the Danish, and the Mexicans was all sort of, you tug on a thread, and then you pull and pull and pull, and you start to find out a way to actually contact all of them. And I started by speaking to them on the phone. We were doing a lot of the early research during the pandemic, so everybody was at home. They were relatively easy to track down. And then a lot of the solid research came, as you mentioned at the top, there was no Wikipedia entry on this. There was nothing, really practically nothing online that we could find. So a lot of it came from the memories of the women themselves, which takes a while to win over their trust. They hadn't spoken about this in almost 50 years, which meant that they were really quite traumatized, and to convince them that this was a place where they could share those memories, and particularly the emotional journey, took quite a while. And so it was between them and then, thankfully, the newspaper clippings that many of the women had kept from Mexico in 71. So the original match reports and the photographs that were in those newspapers is what, we had hard evidence that this had happened, and was a chance to really start going and looking for the footage and the other characters involved.
I mean, you just ticked off those different countries: Italy, France, Denmark, Mexico, Argentina. It sounds misleading when you just list them like that. I have to imagine that each one of those countries was its own process to find the women.
Yeah, very much so. And I could almost say in each of those is a different process in terms of how to build up those relationships. But something that was so striking throughout this process was how strong the collective experience was of all of these women 50 years ago, regardless of whether they came from an industrial town in England or from the center of Mexico City or suburban Buenos Aires. They really had very similar experiences of growing up believing that they were the only girl in the world crazy enough to want to play football, and then all coming together. That actually, I found it was a remarkably similar way to approach them, to encourage them that this was a safe place to share that story, and also to show them that their story was part of a much bigger picture and alongside the other teams. And they were delighted to hear stories of the other teams. They remembered each other all very well. They'd just buried that for 5 decades.
So once you had a pitch together for this project, what was it like to get financing for something that no one had ever heard of before?
It was actually relatively smooth, I think. I mean, it's never easy to get money, but, women's soccer has been very zeitgeisty in Europe and in England. The English team won the Women's Euros a few years back, and so there was sort of a building appetite to hear stories around women's sport and women's soccer that we found. So we felt that there was a real audience that we could reach, or certainly financiers who may have rejected the story a couple of years earlier saw that there was
we should say we did try a couple of years earlier. It was actually at the very beginning, it was pretty hard to get people convinced and interested that this was a story that should be told, particularly on this scale. People might say, well, yes, obviously there's a story in there, and those numbers are very impressive if they're true, but does it really need a feature documentary treatment? Does it really need to be that big? Should we really be putting these women on screen in a cinema in that way?
Yeah, and you run into a prejudice which has happened in the past, where we've had stories of female athletes where distributors have said, yeah, but the sports audience is mainly men, and we're like, yeah, but it's not just about sports; it's about the whole world, and it's great that we were able to find people willing to back that and bring this story into the world. That's one of the struggles that women's sport has had. It doesn't get prime time.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a shoo-in. It wasn't a completely obvious tick box exercise, I think, for some of the people we spoke to early on, particularly the way that we really wanted to approach it, which was being very true to the women themselves, which is having, multiple voices, multiple languages, and also showing, these women who are completely badass and absolute queens in their 70s on screen. It wasn't something that people were necessarily saying was going to be, it's very meta, referencing the tournament itself. People saying it's not necessarily something that people are going to want to watch.
So you started meeting these women, started talking to them, and then when did you find out that there was footage that could help tell this story?
I think, finding the footage, we'd found a very short clip that, may or may not have been mislabeled on one of the wire services. And that showed, and again, the level of disbelief in the fact that this tournament could have existed on this scale for women is that we were finding that, the tournament was mislabeled as a men's match. potentially. But then looking into from the photographs that we had from the newspapers as well, you could see all the cameras in the stadium, and you could see that this had been treated as the Men's World Cup in 1970 was, and the lead broadcaster. So it was all about sort of, again, following our noses and bringing in a really incredible team of archivists from around the world.
The truth is, we didn't know if it was. We knew it had been filmed. We didn't know where to find that, and we backed ourselves up to the very final days that we would in fact find sufficient footage to tell the story the way that we wanted to show it, and to really put people inside the action. And we struck lucky 4 weeks before Picture Lock, where we came upon a cache of beautifully shot film footage that was shot by a guy, I guess a cameraman in the 70s, and somebody was digitizing their grandfather's archive and happened upon it just as we'd posted a Please God social blast. And a lot of the beauty in the football actually comes from those footage that emerged at that very last minute.
So that was footage that an amateur, I want to say videographer, but he would have been using a film camera. And an amateur photographer was taking inside the stadium.
Yeah, so we put out a few weeks before we really did have to lock, we decided it was time to do that last hurrah, and by that time we'd built up a really strong network, both in the sports and film world around Mexico, and we put out a very basic social media post that said, please, were you or any of your family present at any of these matches in 1971, and if so, did you take any photographs or by any chance any film? And I think it was almost within 24 hours, this brilliant guy who, huge now friend of the film, who had been digitizing his grandfather's footage, who had been at the tournament, said, yes, here it is. And I've actually, there's some links here. And so we started to look at that and realized that our editing team had their work cut out for the next couple of weeks in bringing that back in.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
All this time I had assumed that the main chunk of the footage had come from an official Mexican television archive.
No, well, in fact, the footage, pretty much every frame we found is in the film. So we didn't have full matches in any way at all. Our researchers spent many, many weeks trawling through all of the newspapers and through the interviews that we'd done with the women to build up blow-by-blow match reports. Because we didn't have, there was scraps of, and in some of it's in black and white, some of it's in various different formats of the matches themselves, and then our editors and we had to then bring that together to make the matches make sense. But it was very much built from written match reports as well as the footage we had.
Yeah, and bits of like VHS tape that people had kept and stuff, and there were bits that we could find that was not really suitable and poor quality that we were able to sort of piece together. But yeah, it was nothing's labelled in that period of time. Very few things are labelled, and very few things pass by very quickly in broadcast television, particularly in the 1970s. So was it active suppression of that particular footage, or was it neglect, or whether those two combine? For sure the tournament was suppressed, but whether the footage could have emerged sooner, I don't know.
Yeah, and while we're talking about the archive, it's worth a mention of the stills photographs that we have throughout the film, and the cache of those. I mean, quite literally, was in the basement of a library in a Mexican university. And our amazing archive team had tracked down 3 boxes of photographs that were taken by the photographers who were attached to each of the teams during their whole stay in Mexico City. And the boxes had not been opened since 1971. And by that time, that was also sort of halfway through the filming process, and then probably almost 2 years into the research and development. So that we were able to recognize directly the women who were in those photographs, and then again, none of those were labelled. It was just piles and piles of stills and some negatives, and so that was a whole. I think we had a few thousand of those stills to work through in the end, and bring those in.
It sounds like for a long time this film was a bunch of elderly women telling stories for which you just kind of had to go on faith of their stories with very little to show for it.
Well, we had an awful lot of ideas of ways to tell that story visually if that particular footage didn't necessarily turn up. We always have backups. We believed in the story itself and in the women's telling of it, knowing that there would be enough space.
We did actually go as far as have some of the shirts made up with the different teams when we didn't know we had enough footage.
Yes,
and we
there was going to be some.
We were like, because it was quite difficult
filming.
to get them, so we thought, well, maybe get some made up and see and have them on standby at the last minute if we need a shot. So unfortunately, we did not have to to use them.
We had some youth teams on standby and looking for pitches in various parts of sort of southern Spain that may be able to pass for Mexico if we were needing to,
but
to work out other visual
in the
languages.
Film is genuine archive from the tournament.
Yeah, 100%.
So, James, you talked about the suppression of the memory of this tournament. Can you explain a little bit more about FIFA's opposition to the tournament at the time and its recognition afterwards?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the playing of soccer was banned by the English FA in 1921, and it remained banned. Women weren't allowed to play on Football Association facilities for 50 years. That ban was rescinded in 1971. England's kind of, famously the home of soccer, and so a lot of other organisations around the world, associations, followed those rules. And in fact, in extreme cases, women playing football was made illegal in Italy under Mussolini. In Brazil, I believe it was actually a criminal offence until 1986 for women to play football. So the patriarchy is in full force. And FIFA was part of that. FIFA grew out of the English FA originally, and it was dominated by them, and there was no desire at all in 1970, 71 from the male-controlled hierarchy to allow women the right to play, or a recognition that this was a seemly thing. Very Victorian attitudes prevailed, and also that there was no money in it. And if there might even be a little bit of money in it, that would be money that would be taken away from the men, and they didn't really want to do that. And that was the truth of this tournament, really. I mean, maybe Richard should speak to it too, but one of the reasons why it was suppressed afterwards was because it was a success.
Yes, it was such a success that the UEFA, the European Football Associations, made a vote amongst all of its members to say that, would you, and quite a pressured vote, to say that if you have a women's, like sort of a nascent women's football association in your country, it needs to come under the control of the Men's Football Association, and everyone and all of the associated countries voted for that to happen, which meant that in practice, anywhere that grassroots women's football, soccer had been growing was much more easily stunted, and the resources were then taken away from it, which is what happened in Denmark very specifically, is what happened in quite a few other countries. So, even though, and what we really try to show in the film is that since the 1920s, although women's football was banned in many countries, it was still in an underground movement. It was still very much happening. It couldn't be entirely suppressed. It was exploding in the 60s in so many different places, and that's what led to this tournament in 1971. The tournament in 71 didn't come completely out of nowhere. There were something that we don't have time to touch on in this film, but there were qualifying rounds. There were tournaments in the years before. There was something. This wasn't something that was. It wasn't the exception that proved the rule that women's football didn't exist. It was part of a much bigger movement that was regularly repressed. And the success of the 71 tournament very directly led to it being seen as a threat to the establishment, and therefore was why it was so much more effectively crushed afterwards.
Yeah, I think one of the things that saved it was Title IX, actually. Women's soccer booming after Title IX in the States, and of course US women's soccer has been incredibly successful and has been the strongest organisation in sort of trying to keep the footballing authorities honest. I think none of what happens in Europe would have happened had it not been for the explosion of women's soccer through college sport in the US.
So when you meet these women, sit down to interview them, Some of them describe that they haven't talked about this at all in 50 years. For some of them, it had been a traumatic memory to have gone from the high of being in Mexico City playing this game, then to return home. One woman, tells a story of being humiliated in front of an audience in England for being a woman soccer player. So catching up with these women 50 years later, what was it like to draw their memories out?
Well, I think anyone that's spent this amount of time getting to know contributors for a documentary like this and spending and take, we've as a team we've taken on the responsibility of sharing their stories. It's, it sounds a bit trite, but it's a huge privilege. And these women are also absolutely brilliant company. They have so much to say and so many stories to tell, both around the tournament and inside and outside of it. And we decided to approach it slowly. So really getting to know them first. The first time we'd meet them would be in person with no cameras, maybe with some audio kit just to record initial interviews that we can then use later in the film as well, but certainly not shoving cameras in their faces and bringing crew on board. And a lot of that involved, the Italian phrase I feel like was used a lot was andiamo a mangiare. Like whenever we'd arrive, we'd go and eat a meal. So I'd go and spend a lot of time eating meals with these wonderful women and their families, and then suggesting that we'd come back with a camera next time, and would that be all right, and how would that feel? And I think that slow process, and I think the generosity of the team to allow us to do that meant that you could say performances, but ways that they tell their story are so open and are so emotionally driven. And of course, each of those interviews with them is much, much longer than anything that's put into the film. But being able to cut the story line by line between all of those languages and those women meant that they're all giving their full stories and allowing us to piece together the bigger picture from them.
I mean, when we're watching the film, we see footage of some of the moments that they're describing. But from what you've told me now, I'm realizing that when you were interviewing them, you didn't have that footage to show to them. And so it's incredible to me that those women will remember 50 years later, a moment on the pitch where, they were cut off or where a ball was stolen.
Yeah, it's testament to their passion and to their competitive nature, to their athleticism and everything else around it. That yes, they remember exactly every tackle and how much they hurt, or which part of those matches inside and off the pitch as well. They remember the relationships off the pitch, and I think there's something that James and I have talked about, is that there was a decision, which he can probably speak to again, is the decision to not to show them any footage, or even if we did have it, but to really, not wanting to pressurize them or direct them in any way, and to really rely on those memories from such a long time ago.
Yeah, that was key, actually. We didn't want them to make stuff up or suddenly get overcommitted to what wasn't truly the emotion in the time. So in the case of the England team, they'd never seen themselves play at all, ever. They hadn't seen a single frame of footage until they came to the screening that we did after Toronto at the London Film Festival, and they all came and watched it together as a team and saw themselves as a team.
What was the period like between the time you captured these interviews with the women, interviews that they were giving for the first time in 50 years, and then you have to go back to your edit room, which probably took months between the time when you did the interviews and the time when you could actually tell them that a film was finished. Can you talk about that limbo period, and what it meant for you to be holding on to these stories, what it meant for those women to be waiting for the stories to come out?
Yeah, I mean, you always have a responsibility not to overpromise anything. We know we want to share, and we can share the footage and the stills that we have with them, but to make sure that they are these women have the kind of a safe space to watch themselves in as well. and to do it as a team. And I think one of the things that has been the most rewarding, in terms of spending time with these women during the actual filming, is that now they have full reign and full ability to go and do all of their own press interviews. They have effectively their own PR teams, and they're out doing Q&As, and they're speaking to newspapers, and I think there's a level of freedom they now have to tell the story and to know for a fact that people are interested, because they've now seen that there were audiences. They were there in packed out cinemas, people giving them standing ovations, and that is fully giving them more than all the permission that they need to go and really take back their own story. And they don't need us anymore to go and keep talking to people, which is incredibly gratifying.
With most films, there is one hometown screening. Usually, a film is rooted in one particular place, and the screening takes place there that has all its own emotional power. In this case, there's 6 countries where this story has resonance for each of the 6 teams that played there. James, you talked about the screening in London where England's team came together. Maybe I could just ask you to. I'm not going to ask you about all six teams, but I would love to hear a little bit more about what that screening was like.
Well, I mean, London, of course, was extraordinary because they hadn't seen a frame, and they were, also because they didn't do very well, and they knew they didn't do very well. So to sort of be shown in front of their whole family and their grandchildren but it was empowering. And the interesting thing, and it also happened at Toronto when we had the Danish players there, is that they have their memory of it, and they're inside. They were inside the stadium on the pitch. They don't get to see into the other teams' worlds. They don't get to see it from the stadium point of view. They don't get to see it from the fans' point of view and the excitement. And I think that was one of the really big thrills. It was like, we remember we were focused on the game, there, and we knew there was loads of hoopla, but to actually see what it meant to an audience, a live audience, I think was both at the time and in the cinema was pretty thrilling, I think, and also pretty overwhelming. I think I think the first time the English team certainly. And the Danes and the others that saw it, it was very emotionally exciting, but also overwhelming is the right word.
I think our distributors have been amazing. The Italian first Italian screening was hosted in Pordenone, so near Elena's hometown. So she was there fronting that, sending photos and voice notes over WhatsApp. The Mexicans as well all gathered together. They got to sit in the cinema, and again, that wasn't something we could travel to, but but we get a lot of brilliant updates from them and their family. And then Denmark was a bit different because we were able to screen at CPH Docs, and CPH Docs organised a tour of the film around Denmark. It was in 14 different towns, and again, the Danish team, outside of the two players who we have in the film, but other members of the Danish team were able to go and do their own Q&As and hold their own events. And went to Rome last week for a screening there. So we're trying to attend and be as involved as possible, but again, it's just got its own life now. And there are so many different countries and players involved that they're really able to take it. They're doing a lot of school screenings. Some of the women taking it back to their old schools and having it there. So we've been working with amazing impact partners in the UK, and other distributors are following their example as well in different countries. So it's we haven't seen the end of it yet, and it's definitely got a life that's going to keep going for a while, I think.
So there's a section in the film where you're introducing this story to some of the world's top players, Brandi Chastain and Alex Morgan, who played on championship teams for the U.S., and they're discovering this for the first time. Can you talk about what it's been like to reveal this history to people who should probably know it because their lives are so intertwined with the sport.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's extraordinary to show people that you assume that most athletes know their predecessors and what happened before. So, the Brandy and the Alex Morgan interviews were pretty revealing across the whole swathe of things.
Yeah, I think particularly female athletes are proud of knowing the history of their sport because they've had to fight against things in their own right, and they know what it feels like to be coming up against prejudice, whether they're playing, like Brandy in the 90s or playing on more recently with Alex Morgan and any of the other athletes we were talking to. So to see the shock and then pain on their faces when they realize that not only is it something that they didn't know about, but you can feel very quickly they see that parallel world. But how different would it have been, not only for them, but for the players coming before them and after them, if this had been different? What we try and show in this film is that this tournament it lives in a parallel universe. There's this parallel world in which women were not laughed at for wanting to play soccer, that women were allowed to, that were supported, that you had over 110,000 people go to support them, that tickets were sold, that there was merchandise, an awful lot of merchandise at the time. That there was as there's one line in the film from the winner, there were sponsors all around the ground, and this is a real world in which this happened, and it was taken away. And it wasn't just taken away from the women who played in the tournament, it was taken away from all of their descendants and from anyone else that's coming up after that. And I think that was the look that you see in the eyes of these these great athletes now. They recognize that pain, and they feel it very personally.
I want to thank Rachel Ramsay and James Erskine for speaking with me. Their film Copa 71 is now playing in U.S. theaters from Greenwich Films. At Pure Nonfiction, we recently launched a newsletter called Doc Voices, written by Anisha Javeri. You'll find Doc Voices on Substack. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, producer Hannah Nordenswan, partnership manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.